The world moves at a frenetic pace. But every now and then, one individual or a group amongst us crosses a frontier that was deemed unachievable, and that usually has the rest of the world either fixated on a newspaper headline, or collected around a radio, or glued to a television set to witness that momentous event when that frontier was crossed. It generates awe, inspires a whole generation, and creates a new superhero. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we look at some of the awe-inspiring moments when an unachievable frontier was crossed during the course of the 20th century. At the dawn of the 20th century, the ends of the earth had still not been reached. Ends of the earth meaning the North Pole and the South Pole. But before the end of the first decade, North Pole had been conquered, and subsequently, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen decided to focus his attention on reaching the South Pole. But this was the age of exploration and discovery, and many other explorers were trying to be the first. And in case of Amundsen, he had direct competition from the well-resourced British Antarctic expedition sponsored by Her Majesty's Royal Navy under the command of Captain Robert Falcon Scott. Captain Scott, too, was trying to be the first to reach the South Pole. And based on the resources and the sponsorship he definitely had a huge advantage over Amundsen. On October 18, 1911, after the Antarctic winter, Amundsen and his team set out on their drive towards the South Pole. Captain Scott started his trek 3 weeks later on 1st of November 1911. Around 3 p.m. on December 14, 1911, Amundsen raised the flag of Norway at the South Pole. Captain Scott reached the South Pole on 18 January 1912 and was disappointed to see that Amundsen had beaten him in the race. Amundsen and his team returned to their base camp on January 25, 1912, whereas Scott, unfortunately, died on his way back. Wait, a well-equipped exploration team with the backing of the Royal Navy finished second and was not able to return alive? How's that possible? Well, even though Amundsen lacked the resources and the sponsorship, he was a brilliant manager. He understood his environment, was a great risk manager, and knew how to best utilize his resources. So starting with identifying the shortest route to the South Pole. As Amundsen was planning his journey to the South Pole, he noticed that the shortest route to the South Pole was generally avoided by explorers because of a fear of the thin ice sheet. He analyzed the logs of previous expeditions and noticed that not much had changed with respect to the geology of the region. So he decided to take that route. And once he had identified the shortest route, he tried to figure out the fastest way to get to his destination. And that was the use of skis. And subsequently, he recruited a team of well-experienced skiers. Scott, on the other hand, never learned to ski, and he and his men trudged along the journey, pulling their own sledges. The other very important factor was the survival skills that Amundsen learned by spending time with the Netsilik Eskimos, learning about their diet, their clothing, and their survival skills. The journey from the base camp to the South Pole and back took 99 days, so it had to be planned out very well. And one of the key elements of Amundsen's planning was the way he carefully laid out depots along his path. From the last 180 miles of his route, Amundsen laid out marker flags every 8 miles. And from 82 degrees south latitude, Amundsen built a 6 feet cairn every 3 miles with a note inside recording the cairn's position and the distance to the next depot and the direction to the next cairn. A cairn is a human-made pile of stones raised specifically for the purpose of a landmark. And he had a line of bamboo flags laid out transversely every half a mile for 5 miles on either side of the depot so that the returning party did not have any trouble locating the depot, even if there was heavy snow. Amundsen had 3 times the depots than Scott, and this ultimately was the primary factor that led to the demise of Scott and his party on their return journey. The bodies of Scott and his party were discovered around 18 kilometers or 11 miles short of a depot. If they had left enough markers, they would have known the distance and probably trudged along and saved themselves. Amundsen's success at the South Pole was celebrated worldwide with congratulatory telegrams from US President Theodore Roosevelt and King George V of England. Scott, too, was recognized for his achievements and posthumously made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. When Amundsen was asked what made an expedition like this successful, in his own words, he said, "The greatest factor is the way in which the expedition is equipped, the way in which every difficulty is foreseen and precautions taken for meeting or avoiding it. Victory awaits him who has everything in order. Luck, people call it. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take the necessary precautions in time. This is called bad luck." While the British lost out in the race to the South Pole, when it came to mountaineering, especially in the Himalayan range, the British had better luck. A custom developed early in the history of Himalayan climbing, wherein, to avoid confusion, different nations in general took on different peaks. So in the ensuing division, the British got Mount Everest, the highest peak in the world. Except for 2 Swiss parties which tried to climb in 1952, the British had Mount Everest pretty much to themselves. Between the 2 world wars, the only way to approach Everest was from Tibet, because at that time Nepal did not admit any climbing parties. Also, Britain was the only Western country which had good relations with Tibet. In 1949, though, Nepal opened up. And interestingly, in 1951, after China occupied Tibet, Tibet closed itself to mountaineering, so Nepal was the only plausible route to Mount Everest. So what are the core challenges with respect to scaling Mount Everest? Well, for starters, Everest is at an elevation of 8.8 kilometers or 29,031 feet, which means at its summit, it has approximately 1/3 the air pressure that exists at sea level, which essentially reduces a climber's ability to breathe in enough oxygen. According to scientists, the human body cannot stay indefinitely above 19,000 feet. And Everest is at 29,000 feet. Besides the lack of oxygen, there are 2 other factors that make the Everest climb extremely hazardous. The first is the unpredictable weather pattern, and the second is the treacherous terrain. The temperatures range from minus 33 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And besides these, you can be sure to experience heavy snowfall, high winds, and other unpredictable weather conditions. And when it comes to the terrain, it is steep and rocky and requires really strong technical climbing skills. And besides that, due to shifting snow and ice on the mountains, avalanches are frequently triggered. So, due to these geographic and physical obstacles, there were not many stories of success scaling the Mount Everest. In fact, starting from the early 20th century through to the middle, there are only 3 expeditions that can be considered noteworthy. The first one is the 1924 British expedition comprising George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. On the morning of June 6, 1924, after having breakfast, Mallory and Irvine set off from top of the North Column at 23,100 feet, hoping to reach the Mount Everest summit within the next 3 days. Mallory and Irvine were last spotted through the mist in the early afternoon of June 8, 1924, by geologist Noel Odell. He was following behind in support, and he saw them approach and climb a rock step called the second step. And he anticipated that they were pretty close to the base of the summit and would conquer the summit very soon. Unfortunately, that was the last they were seen alive. And it was only 75 years later, in May of 1999, that Mallory's body was eventually discovered at a height of 26,800 feet. His goggles, wristwatch, altimeter, and a monogrammed handkerchief were also recovered from that site. But the camera was never found. And that alone has raised a lot of speculation. Did Mallory and Irvine die on their way up to Everest, or were they killed during the descent after having conquered the summit? And the other mystery is that Andrew Irvine's body was never found. The second noteworthy expedition was the 1952 Swiss expedition, which included legendary Alps mountaineer Raymond Lambert. Lambert had pioneered a route up the steep Lhotse face, which is on the eastern side of the Everest summit, and reached the South Col. A col, or saddle, is the lowest point of a ridge between 2 peaks, and the South Col was the lowest point between the Everest and the Lhotse peaks. So essentially, Raymond had reached the starting point of the final ascent to Mount Everest. There was one major change that had been introduced by the Swiss in this expedition, and that was seeking the help of the local Sherpas. The Sherpas are of Tibetan descent, but reside in the southern foothills of Everest in the Solokhombu district of Nepal. Since they live in the vicinity of the mountain, they are a lot more acclimatized with the weather and surrounding atmosphere. So the Swiss decided to use their expertise in helping them with the ascent to Mount Everest. The Sherpas had helped past expeditions as support staff, helping lug mountaineering equipment and oxygen cylinders. The Swiss expedition, though, tapped into their mountaineering expertise towards coming up with the plan to scale the summit. And Raymond Lambert had hired the services of none other than Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. And this group pushed all the way up to 28,210 feet on the southern ridge before turning back. This was the highest that anyone had reached till that time. The third noteworthy expedition is the spring 1953 expedition led by the British, who were determined to bring every possible advantage to this expedition. And that included hiring the 38-year-old experienced Sherpa, Tenzing Norgay. The expedition was led by Sir John Hunt and had 350 porters, 20 Sherpas, and 10 climbers. John Hunt's plan for this expedition was 2 summit attempts, each by a pair of climbers, with a possible third assault if necessary. And it was up to John Hunt to designate the summit pairs, which would be quite late during the expedition, depending upon how he saw everybody performing. From the start, a 33-year-old beekeeper from New Zealand, Edmund Hillary, was a strong contender for one of the summit slots. It was his 4th Himalayan expedition in just over 2 years, and he was performing at peak of fitness. And the source of his fitness? The heavily glaciated peaks of his native New Zealand, where he had been mountaineering. But the first group identified for the summit bid was Tom Boerdillon, the president of the Oxford Mountaineering Club, and Charles Evans, a brain surgeon. They had a rough start because of problems with Evans's oxygen set, but both men crested the South Summit at 28,700 feet by May 26, 1953. But Evans was exhausted, and both of them knew that they would run out of oxygen if they went on. So they agreed to turn back. So it was only 3 days later that the next group for the summit attempt was identified as Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. And because of his previous mountaineering record, Sir John Hunt preferred Tenzing to accompany Hillary for this second attempt. By 9 a.m. on May 29, Hillary and Tenzing had reached the South Summit. But the difficulties were just starting, because after the South Summit, the ridge takes a slight dip before rising abruptly in a rocky spur, some 40 feet high, just before the true summit. So Hillary had to use his axe to scrape at the snow, chimneying the way between the rock pillar and an adjacent ridge of ice to surmount this major obstacle. This specific spot came to be known as the Hillary Step. But once this obstacle was crossed, the pair reached the highest point on Earth at 11:30 a.m. on May 29. The men shook hands and hugged each other and took pictures. Well, technically only one picture because Tenzing didn't know how to operate the camera. So the only picture that was shared was actually Tenzing Norgay atop the summit, the picture being taken by Edmund Hillary. The news of the success reached Queen Elizabeth II on June 1st, on the eve of her coronation, and the next day, the news broke around the world. Later that year, Hillary and Hunt were knighted by the Queen, and Tenzing Norgay received the British Empire Medal because he was not a citizen of a Commonwealth nation. Besides the combined expertise of Hillary and Norgay, the special oxygen equipment and relatively lightweight outfits worn by the mountaineers also contributed to the success of this mission. 108 minutes in flight on April 12, 1961 took humankind to a whole new frontier. The flight was the first manned space flight. The cosmonaut Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin's one-orbit flight in his Vostok 1 spacecraft ushered in a new era of spaceflight and scored a key victory for the Soviets, who were locked in a struggle for supremacy in space with the United States. The rocket that blasted Vostok 1 and Yuri Gagarin into orbit was the R-7 Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or ICBM, which was originally purposed for launching nukes. Gagarin and 19 other Soviet Air Force pilots had been selected to undergo a cosmonaut training program. Gagarin was eventually chosen for the Vostok 1 flight, partly due to his skill and partly because he was short, 5'2", which was just about the right height to fit him into the cramped capsule. Vostok 1 consisted of a pressurized sphere just 2 meters wide, along with an equipment module that housed the electronics and thrusters that would bring the vehicle back to Earth. In case the re-entry thrusters failed, Gagarin would have re-entered Earth's atmosphere naturally after 10 days. So he had brought with himself enough food and supplies to stay alive in case that happened. Vostok 1 was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, and the pad where the Vostok 1 blasted off is now named Gagarin Start. Shortly after liftoff, Gagarin famously yelled, "Poekali," over the radio, which translates to "let's roll." He entered orbit a few minutes later and was able to see the Earth through a single window near his feet. Most of the flight was automated, but Gagarin had the ability to take manual control of his spacecraft in an emergency. After staying in orbit for 108 minutes, the Vostok 1 prepared to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. But the re-entry was far from smooth. The equipment module did not fully separate and was left attached to Gagarin's capsule by a strand of wires. This threw Gagarin into a spin, causing him to experience 8 Gs of force. That is 8 times the gravitational acceleration on Earth. But as a trained fighter pilot, Gagarin was able to maintain consciousness until the wires broke free and stabilized his descent. About 7 kilometers above Earth, Gagarin ejected from Vostok 1 as planned and parachuted to the ground. A local farmer and his daughter observed the descent and got afraid, and Gagarin had to calm them down and explain to them that he was a Soviet citizen who had descended from space and he just needed to find a telephone to call Moscow. The Soviets kept the news about Gagarin's mission under wraps till he had safely returned to Earth. And then the news was broadcast far and wide via the state news agency TASS. The rest of the world was shocked and in awe. A major frontier in human exploration had just been crossed. About 4 a.m., telephones started buzzing up and down the east coast of the United States as reporters demanded response from NASA officials. The NASA official, who was still half asleep, responded with, "We are all asleep down here." Not to be outdone, the US newspapers were quick to publish the headline, "Soviets put man in space. Spokesman says US asleep." And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. What major impact did Harry Truman's shock defeat of Thomas Dewey have across the political system? The media outlets blamed their early closure of campaign polling for Thomas Dewey's shock defeat. So pollsters started polling through the day of the election. So the answer is D. Pollsters started polling through the day of the election. Question for the current episode. Which of the 4 explorers mentioned in this podcast has their picture on the currency note of their country? Is it A, Sir Edmund Hillary on a New Zealand dollar bill? B, Tenzing Norgay on a Nepalese rupee? C, Roald Amundsen on Norwegian kroner? Or D, Yuri Gagarin on the Russian ruble? Once again, which of the 4 explorers mentioned in this podcast has their picture on the currency note of their country? A, Sir Edmund Hillary on a New Zealand dollar bill, B. Tenzing Norgay on a Nepalese rupee, C. Roald Amundsen on the Norwegian kroner, or D. Yuri Gagarin on the Russian ruble? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we take a look at India when democracy went on a sabbatical for 2 years. Yes, we'll be looking at the period from 1975 to 77 when emergency was imposed in India. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.